Such a pleasure to welcome you all here for an impromptu conversation. I think if you've ever sat with Dr. Hull or with Michael Bertolini over dinner, you are not bored when they begin to talk about the locals in Warwick. So that's what's going to happen here this evening. Two outstanding historians in conversation, and what a pleasure this is going to be. I do want you to know, you're welcome to get up, get a glass of wine, have a cookie, sit and just feel like you've entered someone's living room this evening and are privy to a conversation from the past. Additionally, so you know there are some things happening at the Society. By all means, pay attention to the website, which will give you lots of information. But one of the things that is coming up is George Washington Day, and that's in July. And it celebrates a time when George Washington, not president yet, but General Washington, was here and apparently purchased and enjoyed some grog. And I know, the look on your face, what a surprise. So, in any case, additionally, we are planning a trip to Sicily. It's a 2-week trip. It's going to take place in March through the Warwick Historical Society. Mark Kurtz, our president, is one of the people here who knows the most about it, and there's information down there. So please, if you're at all interested in doing something unbelievably special, come 2016, please be sure to see Mark with regard to that. So gentlemen, if you would just proceed with your private conversation, we're just going to listen in.
Thank you. Good evening, everybody. Well, Richard has done this, and I've done this, and we've done this together. And the last time we did it, we really had a very good time.
We call it the H&B Dog and Pony Show.
Dog and Pony.
Part 2 or 3, we can't remember.
We can't remember though.
We know we've done it once. I think John State, you might remember, I think it was up at the college, we talked about architecture. And we were having a dialogue. But anyway, go ahead, Mike.
So tonight what we're going to cover is the golden, what they call the Gilded or Golden Age. And the Gilded and Golden Age was between 1876 and 1899. And this was at the end of the 19th century. And it was a period in which we had just gone through the Civil War 10 years before. Now, previous to that, in the 18th and 19th century, what we did was fight. We fought the Indians, then we fought the French, then we fought the English, and then we fought the weather, and then we fought the conditions locally in building and construction. And finally, we ended up in 1860 fighting each other. So that's how this whole thing started in the 18th and 19th century. This confusion and this building and this concept of creating a nation. And after all the turmoil and all the hard work, we came to a plateau. And it was about 10 years after the Civil War. Now, we were beginning to look across the pond. And just previous to this, in this 1876 period, Philadelphia was looking towards London because they had done this wonderful exhibition. And the exhibition was to show how marvelous the English were doing with their colonies, with their world. And they asked everyone in the Western world to be able to bring some product of theirs. And they had this wonderful exhibition in London. And it lasted for many years. In fact, actually, the building lasted into the 1930s. But it was built in the 1860s. And it was the Crystal Palace. And the Crystal Palace showed all the products that England had made, fostered, encouraged, or somehow was involved with.
Britain.
May I use England?
No, yes, you must include Scotland, Wales, and Ireland.
I see. We'll say Britain. All right. So what Britain did in that 150 years, because we're working from the late 1600s to the end of the 19th century, and in all those years they're creating their empire. And at that point, the maps were all painted pink, so the sun never set on the English Empire. They were so proud of it, they had the Crystal Palace, and they showed all their products. Now, Philadelphia, which was one of our great centers of culture, now, a little surprising to us because we think of New York as being the great center of culture. Well, New York was third at this period. There was Philadelphia, there was Boston, and then maybe New York, maybe New York. But Philadelphia was really that, and Boston were the great centers. And Philadelphia felt that at that time they should have a great fair, a great showing. And they did an exhibition, and they said it was 100 years, 1776 to 1876, in which they could show the glories of what America had done in those years. And so here we were, 10 years after the Civil War, 10 years after that confusion, and we had created this wonderful thing in the city of brotherly love. So at that point, I'm going to give it over to Richard to tell you a little bit more.
Well, Warwick people went down to this exhibition. This was to celebrate the centennial of the of independence. And America was undergoing a transformation. In the last quarter of the 19th century, we went from being overwhelmingly an agricultural nation to an industrial nation. We would undergo the Industrial Revolution. And by the end of the Gilded Age, coming into the 20th century, America was gaining rapidly on Britain and other European countries, Germany, in terms of our not only industrial output, but inventions as well. And so Warwick people went just down the road here to Philadelphia and were exposed to this exhibition. And they came back and they began to rethink community. They began to rethink their own identities, and they began to think more about the future. Much like we did in 1993 when we were moving toward the 21st century, and an organization was founded here called Community 2000. And Community 2000 had these brainstorming sessions in schools and public places all over town, asking townspeople to come and just talk about what their vision was for the future of Warwick. Well, the same kind of process occurred in the last quarter of the 19th century. And I think it was sparked, and I think Michael probably agrees, that Philadelphia exhibition had something to do with it. And so this was a time when Warwick itself would begin to transform itself. In 1867, the village became incorporated. It developed a new system of government, a board of trustees with a mayor. And the Constitution was structured in such a way for incorporated villages in New York State, the mayors would have a good deal of power, a lot more authority, executive authority and power than, for example, our town supervisors had and would continue to have vis-a-vis their town boards. So that was important too, because it enabled the village mayors and in toward the latter part of the Gilded Age of the 19th century, we had Clinton Wisner as our mayor. And Wisner had the power to translate his vision, and he had an amazing vision for this community, this village, into reality. He had the power to do that. And he did. And we began to see, for example, in the early 1870s, the establishment, the construction of reservoirs and piped water being brought into the village. We saw the construction, new infrastructure in the village and in the town as well. Bridges, for example, that were formerly built of stone or wood were replaced by iron. And a very good example of that is the bridge over the Wawiata right here in Warwick Village, behind Main Street here. That you'll see a plaque and it says 1883. And the 1880s was a time when infrastructure, in terms of our roads and bridges and so forth, was really moving forward quite quickly. And so people were beginning to get excited about Warwick's future, beginning to think in a futuristic way. Now, part of that, I think, was influenced by Charles Darwin, believe it or not. Charles Darwin came out in 1859 with his path-breaking book, Origin of Species. And Darwinism itself, the theory, of course, was that everything is evolving. don't look at anything as being static. Look at your institutions, your political institutions, your legal institutions. They are evolving, and they must continue to evolve. They must continue to move and to adjust to changing situations. And I think that began to put people into a certain mindset as well. And from Darwinism grew a movement called social Darwinism. Now, social Darwinism, some would argue, was a perversion of Darwinism because it spun off this theory of survival of the fittest, that humans evolved and that Caucasians had evolved further than blacks and other racial groups. This is a time when people were thinking more in terms of race. And we began to see, for example, legislation at every level of government, including the federal government, legislation and laws, court cases such as Plessy versus Ferguson of 1896, which said that separate but equal is okay. That it's okay to have segregation in America, to segregate blacks and whites, as long as you provide equal facilities for blacks. Of course, that didn't happen. But again, it was a time of ferment. It was a time when people were thinking in different ways and through different frameworks. It was a time of great ferment, of restlessness. People were examining the nation's institutions and often found them wanting. It was also a time of progressivism, the progressive movement, which was going out of the German communities in the Midwest who had come to America after the Revolution of 1848, La Follette and others. And they were part of a movement that was saying, you know, we've got to engage in social reform. This was the foundation of Hull House in Chicago, which is one of the earliest institutions for social reform. And so it was a very exciting time. It was a time of change everywhere, from the grassroots level right here in Warwick, moving upward to the state and to the national level as well. And we would see, too, the impact of the Civil War. At the time of the Civil War, hundreds and hundreds of Warwick young men left Warwick to fight in the war. You can see the plaque in our town hall, and it's quite impressive how many people here went off to war. And where were they fighting? They were fighting as nearby as Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, but some were going into the south, southwest, and other parts of the country. And during that time, women had to begin to take on more responsibility. There were labor shortages because so many able-bodied men were away. So women became more assertive, gained more confidence. And many of these men, when they came back after the war, had all these experiences, and they began to think differently about themselves and about their community and so forth. So that had something to do with this period from 1876 onward to this so-called Gilded Age or the New Age. And I think also it had an effect on African Americans because for the first time African Americans could have money, because those African Americans that fought on the Union side of the Civil War received pensions. And so when they came back to Warwick, they had a small, modest pension, but enough that they saved. They could start small businesses, and they could even buy property and build houses. So we see for the first time African American Warwickians beginning to become more self-sufficient and gaining in a degree of self-confidence. So I'll pass it back to you.
There's the war, the Civil War, was one of the great changes for us here in this part of the country, as well as the rest of this country on the eastern seaboard. And one of the reasons was, of course, that they had learned so much. This was the first time that these little farm boys could get out of their little world in which Grandpa lived that way, Father lived that way, they lived that way. And it was looking as if they would all continue living that way. They were pulled out, they were rooted out, and they were sent hundreds of miles away to a different world, to a different thinking pattern. And so this, when they came back, the lucky ones, when they came back, they brought new ideas. And of course, that's the basis of any kind of forward movement. So in that way, these people had seen something else other than their own little houses, their own little farms. Then, of course, the military, with all of the material that was left over, they had to think of what to do with all those boys that still, they didn't want to go back to the farms. They wanted to do something to go beyond what they knew. So they were concerned with, what do we do with those? And that's the expansion west. And at that same time, these are the boys that were taught and were trained, and the military had to learn this, how to make roads, how to do something with the railroad, how to move material, how to build warehouses, how to advance civilization. Because truly, if we had not had the Civil War, as horrible as it was, if we hadn't had that, we probably would have remained a third-rate power for another 50, 60 years. But that forced us in the foreground. Now, according to Europeans, we were still new shoe leather and fresh cement. They didn't think of us as anything as the third level, because England, who was so powerful, England, who was so powerful, Germany, who was so powerful, Russia, who was coming up behind them, France, who had great power and still had a lot of push. These were the people that formed everything. And so between what they had over there and what our people were learning here, there was a great outburst for everything. It's when things became so easy, paper pulp came in. And the wood pulp made into paper, made it cheap paper, made newspapers more available.
Cheap newspapers.
Cheap newspapers. Libraries. All of this was something that you could give the people that they never had before. Factories. The factories had been started in the war, and they were doing wool for the blankets or wool for the uniforms. After the war, they didn't throw the factories away. They expanded on them.
Textile industry.
Slater, with the textile manufacturing up in Massachusetts, they made millions on that because the cotton didn't have to be sent to England any longer. We could do it here. And the railroads, they saw what you could do with the railroads when they moved from the north to the south that did not have railroads. And so when they saw that, the expansion, the way of doing things on the railroad coupling, the minute that they put that so that they could connect these cars together, this all advanced, this all made a forward push, and all of this created our empire. And so here we are in the 1870s and 1880s with this pulsing country, this absolutely popping country, and they're doing all these wondrous things, and they have all the space and all the energy to do it. And so we are creating these things. Now in turn, they were smart enough to be able to have to look across the waters to see how things were being done over there, because they had already advanced beyond what we were doing. We had to catch up to them at that point. We caught up to them, and then we went beyond them at that point. And so now I'll give it back to you.
Okay, let me just pick up on the migration. Michael said after the Civil War, many young men left the farm and went west. A very good example was one of the members of the Wisner family. Now, another reason for that was that coming into the 1870s and 1880s, there were huge advances in agricultural technology. New mowing, mechanical mowing devices, new plows, new types of saws to cut wood and so forth. And we began to see in Warwick the transformation of our landscape. Up until this time, Warwick was still a heavily wooded area. Farms or cleared farmland was not very extensive. But this all began to change. So not only did our landscape begin to become transformed with more land under cultivation, but because of mechanization of agriculture, you didn't need as much labor. You didn't need large families anymore. We began to see demographic change. We began to see that in the last quarter of the 19th century, before that time, it was typical for families in Warwick to have 5, 6, sometimes 8 or 9 or 10 children. But this all began to change quite dramatically. Now we'd see maybe 4 children, 5 tops. in many cases. But many young men could not find agricultural work anymore because machinery was taking over. One mowing machine could mow a field in a matter of hours. It would take many men a few days. So a lot of these young people went west. They moved westward. Chicago was a very popular spot because of all the opportunity there. And Wisner was a very good example.
The Roosevelts.
And the Roosevelts. I mean, there were many. And we have in our archives here memoirs, notebooks of young Warwick people who went west more than 100 years ago. They make for fascinating reading. The Wellings, the Wheelers, many members of these families did this migration. Not only going west, but they were going toward New York, too. I mean, my own great-grandfather, for example, right after the Civil War, moved to New York and went into business in New York City. Eventually came back to Orange County decades later. But that movement toward urban areas and the growth of these urban areas as well, we began to see accelerate in the last quarter of the 19th century.
Well, you mentioned families. Life on the farm. America was made of farms, mostly farms. And the religion and the process of living and of growing things, the techniques of establishing a community, the interplay with the members of the community, all of this was found on the basis of the family. And as Richard said, well, they had the large families, you had them for a reason. A lot of them died. They would die before they were 2 or 3 years old.
Mortality.
So the mortality was unbelievable. And you had to have the son to carry on. You also had to have one daughter that was going to stay in the family, that was going to take care of you and your wife, because that was the way it was set up. Somebody was going to take care of the elderly, and somebody was going to take care of the farm. And all of that, I say, after the war broke up, just as you said. And the living on the farm, the ability now, because of the railroad coming in, the ability of being able to get produce, the ability to be able to get other things, to be able to live, well, it was much easier because you didn't have to make everything. When the milk was put in a tin can for the Civil War soldiers, and the idea of food in a tin can, that made
and that was Mr. Borden, a local farmer.
Local farmer that put, which is pet milk, put milk in a tin can and sold the whole concept to the U.S. Army. Then people realized that preserving food and putting it in these metal containers, it wouldn't break. It could be shipped anywhere. And so you didn't have to do that back-breaking thing of all that preserves for the winter. Then they began learning how to insulate those railroad cars. And they brought
refrigerated milk cars.
The milk cars.
Thaddeus Selleck, 1842, the Erie Railroad came through Orange County, through Chester. Thaddeus Selleck was the station agent at the new station that was built in Chester. And it was Thaddeus Selleck, in America. He was the one who came up with the idea of refrigerated milk cars. And the first milk car to leave Orange County left the Chester station in May of 1842.
Yeah, that's early.
And that was one of the turning points, the way
more
our
change,
lifestyle, the way we thought about ourselves and our world, becoming a photography, for example. Every family, I mean, it was very middle class to gather your family together and go to a photography studio and have a family picture, family photo. And there was one very successful photographer in Warwick, and I can't think of his name. He had his photography shop on the corner of West Street and Main here. And he did very well. This is more than a century ago. And every family in Warwick who could afford it would have a family picture taken down.
And music here, to have a piano in the house, to have a band on the street, to have a kid that played the violin. All of these things were available at this time.
In fact, the
Which
Warwick Cornet Band was formed in 1878.
And
Suddenly,
here we are,
I mean,
right
that
now.
said something too. I mean, you could have a cornet band. Well, by that time, there were a number of people who now could play a whole variety of musical instruments.
First to buy the instrument and then have the kid to play the instrument. It's all very, very important. It's all steps. It's all steps. All steps up.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's a wonderful sound and sight to be able to see how this village of ours was created from a very simple farm and inverted civilization that they had here until this terrible situation happened with the Civil War. And then all, hard to say, but all the good that came out of that war. Not so much for the South, but certainly for the North. And we received untold, simple things like you said so much about taking the milk down to the train. Well, the local farmers were enlightened enough, and Sanfords were the ones that did it. They lined the streets with maple trees.
Trees, yeah,
And the idea was,
broadleaf maple trees.
yeah, so that when they put the milk on the wagon at the farm, then they could ride under the shade of the tree all the way down to the railroad station, so that there wouldn't be any chance for the milk to sour.
So the major routes, the major roads leading down to the railroad were planted in trees, beginning with in the 1860s, 1860s,
After the war.
70s, and 80s. I remember as a child, and some of you who've been here long enough might remember this, you could, as you approach Warwick Village at about Maple Terrace Farm, it was like going into a tunnel because there were so many maple trees.
Big.
And by that time they were arching over Maple Avenue. I remember one of my earliest memories actually of Warwick, even before he bought a farm here, was coming down from a Hamiltonian race in Goshen. It was about 1947, 48. And we hit Maple Avenue here, and I was just like this. I was just a little kid. Holy smoke, look at this. This is fun going down this road in the middle of the day, and it was so deeply shaded.
Unfortunately, the salt and the different situations.
They died very quickly. Very, very quickly.
We have very few of them left on Maple.
Yeah, from the county and town, village highway departments decided that there were too many automobile accidents, too much ice in the road in the wintertime, and the cheapest and best and quickest way of dealing with this was to throw salt on the road. And in the early period, I guess they got big contracts for salt. And they had to use it all up by the end of the winter. They didn't want to be stuck with mounds of salt as large as this room. So they would just throw it on, just get it on, get it out and throw it on the roads. And many species of trees, and particularly sugar maples, couldn't survive that. And they died very quickly. I have a photograph taken in 1968 of Maple Avenue, when there were still a number of them. They were dying rapidly. And then I took a photograph in 1975. Maybe John Stage took that picture for my people of the valley. I can't remember, but they'd almost disappeared. They're almost all dead. They're all gone.
I got 3 left.
Pardon?
I have 3 left.
You have 3 left.
I lost 1 last year.
Yeah. It was a great
In my
time.
house, they're all gone. And Maple Avenue.
Why don't they use sand?
Pardon?
Why don't they use sand and then salt?
Salt was easier to get.
Salt was much easier, and there was a lot of it. But it's also interesting that that spurred the first town shade tree commission in New York State history. And it was Nina's mom and myself and a group of us, Dave Brandt, Michael Maduras, and a number of other people. We gathered together and we met with John Beatty, who was the attorney here, and we said, we've got to have a shade tree, we've got to have some regulations. And we have to have a program where we can replace these trees and so forth. So we went to Ben Gilman, who was our legislator, our assemblyman in Albany at that time, later to become our congressman. And we go up to Albany and we crafted a series of laws that were later emulated by towns all over New York State. It started right here in Warwick. And almost coterminously, just almost at the same time, Roger Metzger stepped forward and said, well, you know, the village, we should have village shade tree commissions as well. So Roger,
He had the knowledge.
and he had the knowledge because he worked for Orange and Rockland.
Right.
And so Roger started the Village Shade Tree Commission, and when you know, Roger's in his 80s now, and he's probably one of the longest serving village commissioners, maybe in New York State history, because he's still the Village Shade Tree Commissioner here in town, and he's still planting shade trees.
That's what happened in this village. The same with the Architectural Review Board. It came into being because McDonald's was put down where the old movie house was. And everyone said when that happened
Burger King.
overnight, Burger King,
Yeah.
when that happened overnight, then everyone said, we've got to, Brown was the one that started that. But we have to have an Architectural Review Board to save whatever we have in the community.
Exactly.
And so that's what started the historical district.
And Warwick has, for generations, I think, been in the forefront as innovators. Warwick has a strong civic spirit, as you know, but we've always had a strong innovative spirit. We've always had a willingness to try something new, to try to find a better way of doing something, or to find a better way of protecting, whether it's our land. Look at PDR. We were pioneers in New York State in land preservation. Towns all over the state now are following us. They come down here to see how we've been able to save thousands of acres of farmland here in Warwick over the last 10 years. We've always been in the forefront in so many ways, and we developed an enviable reputation for that.
Look at the Historical Society with the Sanfords and the Lewises and the Bradners who got together with the Green.
Yes.
And what happened with, otherwise we would have none of that in the middle of the village.
We would not.
No.
We would not.
These people
I mean, the
were
old
forward
schoolhouse
going.
meeting house was about to be demolished.
Yeah.
It was on the verge. It was just
It was to be.
weeks before it was to be knocked down, and the whole land over there was to be leveled off. And
It was started with putting a parking lot.
a parking lot.
A parking lot.
But look at the Warwick Historical Society, the town of Warwick Historical Society. We were one of the earliest in New York State. There were city historical, like Newburgh had a historical society that goes back to the 1890s. There were large cities, medium-sized cities, but we were one of the first town historical societies, and we're over 100 years old.
Over 100 years old.
Yeah. So we've been leaders.
There was an awareness. It's very important, the awareness.
Community hospital. We had our first hospital here in 1916 with a surgical suite, and Dr. Bradner was a world-class surgeon. I mean, he went off to war and came back, and he performed so many operations. I mean, everybody wanted to be operated on by Dr. Bradner because he could do just about anything. I mean, he could take any part of your body out and do something with it, sew you up again, and send you home.
Well, he learned the hard way in the First World War.
Yeah,
In the mountains of Yugoslavia.
Exactly, Serbia. And
Serbia.
so here we had 1916, our hospital started in the Servant Mansion next door to us here, and then ultimately the construction of St. Anthony. I think Nina was the first baby born in St. Anthony, weren't you, Nina?
No, I don't think so.
You weren't? Okay. Well, someone in your family or someone, there was someone I talked to not long, about 2
No,
years
I'm
ago,
39.
who was the first baby born in St. Anthony.
I thought I was the last one born.
Listen, St. Anthony opened in 1939, so it's not so old, you know, it's not that it opened in 1920 or so. But anyway, so St. Anthony became a hospital that would service not only Warwick, but would service New Jersey as well. Communities in New Jersey would send. I think they still do. I still see ambulances coming up
especially
from Vernon and
for the pavilion.
yeah,
Absolutely. Work
absolutely.
at the pavilion. Yeah.
So now another thing, Michael, do you want to say something about churches too? Maybe we can
Well,
talk about it.
let's start talking about churches. You start talking about it, then I'll do the architecture.
Okay, well, church ministers, Warwick was filled with very articulate ministers in the 19th century. We had some really extraordinary ones in the early part of the 20th century, Tabor and Knox being one of them in the Reformed church here. These guys were very energetic. They were more than ministers. I mean, Knox was partly responsible for the establishment of the Appalachian Trail system. He was the one who organized young men to go out and blaze our section of the Appalachian Trail. And He was involved in scouting and Boy Scouts, and so were many of the other pastors. They had a tremendous amount of influence here, cultural, religious, political, newspapers. The Warwick Advertiser was founded by a minister, and I think that's important to remember too. It was a very spiritual community, but a community in ferment in the last part, in the second half, and really the last quarter of the 19th century. Look at the Baptists. The Baptists were an extremely powerful group, congregation here in Warwick. They went back before the Revolutionary War, and they built this beautiful meeting house here, and but factions developed. The issue of slavery, for example. The church congregation became very divided on slavery. Some were abolitionists, others were not. They were divided on Sunday school. Should we have a Sunday school or not? No, no Sunday school. Should we have music in the services? No music, no piano, no organs, nothing. Can we dance? Can we have social events? No dancing, no dancing. Well, finally, a group said, hey, wait a minute, this is getting to be boring. I'm going to look up and see the minister way up there in that hourglass pulpit.
Get a crick in your
So a group broke off and formed a new Baptist congregation. They became the Old School Baptists, and the new Baptists built an equally beautiful, almost beautiful, we argue, but very architecturally a very distinguished church on West Street, which is now a fitness center.
Right.
And they were.
That's all right. It's still there. It's still there.
It's still there. It still stands. The building anyway. But they weren't the only ones. The Reformed Church used to be they were Presbyterians, and they became Dutch Reformed. And
that's the church right across the street, which is now the Village Hall.
Village Hall, yeah, that was the original church, and so there was a lot of religious ferment going on here in Warwick. Darwinism also created a great deal of division. There were Darwinists and there were anti-Darwinists within congregations. Many saw Darwinism as a real threat to biblical scripture. The Methodists were huge. The first Methodist church was the Little Sugarloaf Church, which was established in 1804. But the Methodists decided in the 1840s that they wanted a church in every single village and hamlet in America. And they started building them all over the place. So Belleville got its Methodist church, Milford got its Methodist church, Warwick got its Methodist church, Edenville got a Methodist church. I mean, Methodist churches were all over the place. And most of them were in the same style, Greek Revival, Doric Temple style. Not all, but by the 1850s, that was becoming the predominant style. So if you saw a Greek Revival, Doric Temple building, you said, oh, they must be Methodists. And they became, interestingly, while they were numerical in terms of the total number of people affiliated with churches in Warwick, most were Methodists. They didn't have the kind of influence, though, that, say, the Dutch Reformed people had. Now, the Catholic Church, Catholicism was a little more recent to Warwick. There was of course, there was the Episcopal Church, which had broken off from the Church of England a long time ago. We had the Episcopal Church, which was had, in fact, rather distinguished congregation. Christ Church here in town, the Episcopal. Catholicism began to grow rapidly with the coming of the Polish people. And we see, for example, the large Catholic church being built in Pine Island, one in Florida, the village of Florida. We had a Catholic church being built right here on Church Street. That's how I got the same church, a small Catholic church. But by the I'd say the second decade of the 20th century, Catholicism was growing with St. Stephen's.
The Middle Europeans that came.
And the Middle Europeans, exactly. Yeah. So I'll swing over to you again, Mike.
The building of the church is very interesting because some of the earliest examples, of course, is the Old School Baptist Meeting House. And that, of course, is done in a countrified version of Christopher Wren. Now, Christopher Wren did this marvelous churches in London after a great fire that was there, and there was a new thought in how these buildings should be built. And so it had to do architecturally with the framing around the window, because so many during the fire had these very, very elaborate cornices over the window and very, very elaborate thresholds and cornices over the doors. This was, of course, a style that had come from the Renaissance and had been done for the city and caught fire and burned, and they couldn't, they found that they wanted to simplify, so they went back to a very, very simple Gothic design, which of course the Gothic design basically are the two hands in the shape of prayer, so that you see all the windows over at the Old School Baptist Meeting House in the pure Gothic, pointed Gothic design. And the interior of it, the way we have it now, is an example of what happened in so many of those churches. It was so much plainer when it was first built in 1810, and then 1840, again, it's the old story, they got richer. This is something that happens all through architecture in this part of the Hudson Valley. They wanted to be modern, they wanted to be a little bit more elaborate, so they gutted the interior of the church, and where they had no center aisle, they put in a center aisle, and a very elaborate altar. And that, of course, is since in the 1950s when they restored the place. This is at the time that Richard is talking about, that they realized that it was going to be torn down. And these three families got together and put some money into the place and were backed by many other families at the time. But they decided to try to reorganize the church as it was originally. And so they knew that it had what they call a wine glass pulpit in it. And so they copied the wine glass pulpit, put it in, and so recreated the sense of the very early 19th century church. The other church that you mentioned, which is now a fit center, is taken more of a later Renaissance church with the great overdoors. That's the kind of overdoor I'm telling you about that in London burned. But they wanted to copy that rather elaborate style. But that's much later. That's about 1880, then later. 1890, 1900. So other than that, most of our churches are really quite simple. They did, as Richard said, they did copy this wonderful temple design that came back from the Roman and Greek days with the box of a building in 4 columns and a...
it was very boxy.
Very boxy, very boxy. And then, of course, the most simple churches that we have is like the UAME church, which is a simple little box with just a little simple stoop in the front. And then, of course, was the African American church that we had, that we have preserved. And this fall will be opened. And so I hope all of you will come to that in September when we open that church again. We're very proud of that, because it really was a very hard job to get it put back into the shape that it's in. Now that in turn will be used for lectures.
Exactly.
It will be used for gallery, and so we're looking forward to that.
People often ask me, well, why were we in such ferment? Why did people in Warwick always be? Why do we have so many organizations and so much dialogue going on within the community? And my answer that I often give is Warwick had 2 newspapers and still does have 2 newspapers. The Warwick Advertiser, which was founded in 1866, the Warwick Valley Dispatch, founded in 1885. Those 2 papers, through most of their lifetimes, had different orientations. I mean, the Advertiser tended to be a Republican paper, and the Dispatch tended to be a Democratic paper. And even though the publishers, the Ketchum family and the, I'm drawing a blank.
Right.
Pardon?
Right.
The Wright family, Ketchum family, the Wright family, own those papers. They're independent papers, but they provided a forum for the expression of different points of view. Different points of view, and they competed with each other. The families were friendly, they helped each other, they're extremely cordial, they're members of common organizations, but the papers gave expressed different points of view every week, and they were published every week, even during the depths of the Great Depression. They haven't missed a week. Extraordinary. And I feel that if we didn't have those two papers, Warwick wouldn't be what it is today. And also because when people did good things and accomplished good things, you read about them in the papers. And I think people naturally have egos. And if you've done something you feel good about, it's nice to pick up the paper the next week and see a story about what you did. And it would just spur you onward. It would encourage you.
And it does. It does.
Yeah, of course. So I feel that our history of journalism in Warwick is a very rich history and an extremely important history. And the fact that even today, we have WTBQ, we have our own radio station in this town. I mean, it's really amazing. And we have the Greenwood Lake News until recently. So I think we have to look at that. And then the Historical Society. You're never going to really appreciate and understand these things if you don't have some place, some repository, some archive, some place you can go to learn about all this. How are you going to know this if you don't have a place where you can, like us, talk about it and where you go in and read about it, and learn about it, and so forth. And so I think that two essential pillars of a healthy community are its communications and the instruments of communication and the preservation of these things so that ours and future generations can understand where we have come from. How did this come about? How did that library get built, or that hospital, or that church, or that school, or, I mean, who did it and why and what motivated them? But we don't understand those things. We aren't going to go anywhere. We aren't going to continue to grow and become a even richer community. And we are already, I think, already very proud of this community. But these are essential pillars that we must support, because if we don't, this community will not survive as a vibrant, exciting community that we want to live in and we want our future generations to be in.
And there's kudos to those people that were aware that in the education system today, as we know it, there was no place for history. And so the Warwick Historical Society stepped in there, and it is remarkable what this group of people have done with the education system. They have gone there, they've talked to them, they've been received, and they're trying to do all sorts of things on a simple basis to bring to the different classes some form, some phase of history. And they do it either with the traveling trunk, or they kill themselves with having 400, 300, and 400 kids in the different buildings here during the year and in the summertime of having a camp. And of course, those people should really be honored, because they're the ones that are the keepers of the flame.
Absolutely.
They are the ones that are giving these children, who, today, I don't know if you're aware of it, there is just really, there's no interest or care to be able to give them a history of the past. And we're all people that are interested in the past. And these people are the ones in the foreground doing it.
And I'd like to say that next Monday, actually, I have a radio program called History Alive. It's a weekly hour program on Monday. And what I do is I take a contemporary issue that we all feel strongly about and affects us in our everyday lives. And then I go back into the past. I look at how did this issue come about? What were its origins? And how has it evolved to reach the point that we're at today with this issue? And so I put a contemporary problem in historical context to better understand it. And the show usually ends with, all right, now where are we going with this issue? Is it, how are we going to either improve upon the issue if it's a problem, or if it's something great, how can we make it even better for the future? Showing people, making people appreciate that when you're dealing with problems, number one, you've got to deal with problems in a broad perspective and think historically, but you can use history as an important planning tool to project into the future. Next Monday, Mark Kurtz, our Historical Society president, and Marianne Knight are going to be my guests. And we're going to talk a little bit about the Historical Society and what we're doing now. And I have invited Marianne because she is chairman of our education committee. And she gave a report to the board the other day that would knock your socks off. I mean, what her group has done the past few years, particularly this past year in our schools, is just amazing. I'm an educator, and when I read Marianne's report, the last 2 monthly reports, I said, you know, people in Warwick have to know more about this because it's really, I think it's quite impressive. So next Monday, 11 o'clock to 11:03 to noon, if you can tune into WTBQ, Mark and Marianne and I are going to have a talk about all of this stuff. Okay, well, I think
We've covered.
we've probably covered more time. We could spend a little time on Q&A, I guess.
Exactly what I was going to invite people to do, so
I
stay.
just wanted to ask about that hoodoo parade thing that was in the paper.
Amazing, front page,
What is
kudos
that?
to Bob Quinn, let me tell you, thank you so much.
Was it Bob?
It was, and
What is the hoodoo?
you know, this is an interesting thing. Apparently it was a parade that took place after a long, hard winter. And people were just celebrating spring, and so that's what they did. And so I had sent it, and I had asked our archivist, Catherine Anders, for a picture that might just kind of pull together this talk. And she said, I know where the picture is. She found it for me, and I sent it on to him with a suggestion that we do something maybe next spring to say, let's do this. Let's do a hoodoo parade. Let's do something fun and kind of recreate a time gone by. So I'm glad you saw it and asked.
Well, I wondered about where the name came from.
That I don't know.
Okay, never mind.
But again, there are 3 articles, quite old articles, that were in the Advertiser, and I'm guessing that's going to give us a hint.
That'd be cool.
Here we go. Yeah, but thanks for asking.
I must say, we really have quite an impressive archives here, and we have some very impressive people who operate and manage that
It
archive.
really is true.
And we're trying to, for example, get the business community to realize that many businesses here can profit from our archives, learning more about the origins of their business, how they developed, and so forth and so on, because we really have a surprisingly large number of businesses, not only here in the village, but throughout the town, that go back a long ways. I mean, look at Miller Monument Works, the business that makes tombstones, is the oldest, I think the oldest business in Warwick. It goes back to the Civil War period. But we have a lot of them. And here we are, right here, right upstairs, and it's amazing what you can find.
And downstairs, we have a fabulous costume district,
Boy, don't
which
we ever.
has over 1,000 costumes downstairs. And we now cover from 1820 through to the 1990s. So that's quite a coverage. We're very
And
proud of it.
are we having a show on
We're-
costumes of the
1930s,
30s.
within a few weeks, you must come and see. We're having one. It's cocktails on the front porch in the 1930s. And so it's summer cocktails.
Is that here?
Right here.
Yeah.
So you must come and see that. But we have all sorts of wonderful things.
Warwick is, we're newcomers. We've only been here 15 years, so we're relatively new. But Warwick is very well known across the nation as being a destination community. People come from all over the place to visit. Is there any thought, and I'm going to show my ignorance here, please forgive me, is there any thought of opening this up and using this as an even greater attraction for those folks that are coming to Warwick and that, you know, want to enjoy more than just apple orchards and dairy farms and great shopping and things of that sort, but to help really expose what Warwick's all about and where it came from?
Well, we're working at that. Yeah, we're working.
We have 11 or 12 museums. Mark?
Museum buildings, yeah.
Museum
Yes,
buildings
yes.
already.
Yeah, very aware of that. But I'm saying to make it more of a,
There is a gentleman who is bringing tours up from New York City, and they are going to enter at the farmers market, and hopefully some of them will will decide to come to our buildings. We have last year a very aggressive program trying to open the buildings for public use. It was marginally effective. We've been cautioned about museum status, opening the buildings and trying to keep them open and run as museums is just not tenable from the point of view of finances, basically. But yes, we're definitely moving in that direction, and with Mary Ann toward a lot toward kids, availability for kids, and my good friend Rob Garbutt has totally, with volunteer help, done over the AME Church. That we're hoping to be an attractive place for people, and going forward, we're really hoping to do a lot more, bring the community into our places and bring the outside world into our places. Yes.
And the various buildings have already become themed in a sense. I mean, we have in the carriage house medical history. We created a doctor's office a century ago. The AME building the theme will overall be civil rights, won't it?
Yes.
Black history and
Black history, but civil rights,
civil
going
rights
back
also.
to the very early period in American history, and will celebrate and bring to people's attention civil rights.
We're reaching out with that one, the AME. We're reaching out to artists in the community, and we are going to give artists the chance through a grant, I hope, to earn some money in portraying the history of the Warwick Black community and civil rights in general.
We're also looking at the possibility of a mobile, using your mobile device to be able to sort of point and shoot to the various buildings and have a walking tour. So anyone who comes to Warwick would have an opportunity to make a connection, whether or not we happen to have a volunteer on staff in that moment.
All of these projects take two things. They take money and they take people. So we're now in the process of trying to get money, and you'll hear from us in that regard.
And if any of these projects have piqued your interest, feel free to see that man on the way out the door.
Any other questions?
Well, thank you very much.
Thank you very much.